With massive layoffs in nearly every sector, weakness in manufacturing, car sales and housing, and the biggest one-month decline in the trade deficit since the financial crisis, the economic picture is not looking good, which might explain why so many billionaires are loading up on gold, including hedge fund manager John Paulson and real estate mogul Sam Zell. Bottom line, now is the time to own gold, which is why the experts at Stansberry Research just stepped forward with a major gold prediction, arguing gold could soar as high as $3,000 by the end of the year, possibly even higher. You can find out why and get instant access to their #1 gold investment today. It's not bullion, an ETF, or a mining stock, but in the past, this gold strategy could have made you nearly 50x your money. Considering how quickly the price of gold has been moving in recent weeks, you don't want to waste any time missing out on the gains these experts believe are in store for this gold stock. To get a copy of his new free report with all the details, simply go to goldmaniareport.com. Again, that's goldmaniareport.com for a free copy of his new report. Hi, this is Daniela Cambone, and welcome back to the Daniela Cambone Show on Stansberry Research. Today, my guest is a man who correctly forecasted the 2001 tech stock collapse, the 2008 financial crisis, and now he's back warning us that central bank digital currencies are coming faster than we think in 2023. Please welcome to the show best-selling author Doug Casey. Doug, always good to see you. Happy New Year. I'm still saying it. There you go. How are you doing?
Good. I'm speaking to you from sunny, backward, but quiet and peaceful Uruguay at the moment.
Well, you're definitely in a better place than I am in a very loud, noisy, and cold New York City. But happy to be with you today. Hopefully some of your thoughts will warm us. Maybe not. Maybe they'll just give us chills. Want to talk your forecast for 2023. Want to get your thoughts on investment strategies for the year and so much more. But let's start with some of your forecasts. Most notably, you've come out saying that we are going to get central bank digital currencies in 2023, and this is one of the scariest things on the horizon. Now, we did see in 2022 a record number of countries, I believe 114, working on pilot projects on central bank digital currencies. And the New York Fed, by the way, announced in November that they would launch a 12-week pilot project in collaboration with commercial banks for a central bank digital currency, kind of a news item that was under the radar there. So to your point and to these points, can you give us your thesis here on why you think they're coming faster than we think?
Well, the problem comes back to central banks themselves. It seems that most people think that they're part of the cosmic firmament, but they're a fairly recent innovation. For most countries, they've only been around 100 years, and they're a complete disaster from the point of view of the common man. These idiots are responsible for printing gigantic amounts of currency units, which is to say they're responsible for retail price rises, huge distortions in the economy. And over the last 20 years, things have really gotten out of control. This is a long-term trend. It started 100 years ago. But over the last 20 years, it's gotten completely out of control, where they've gone to ZIRP, zero interest rate policy. I thought it was metaphysically impossible for interest rates to go below zero, but they did for a significant period of time. But now interest rates are going to be heading up, regardless of what they say or do, for reasons we could talk about. They've gone to massive quantitative easing, printing up trillions of currency units. This is to maintain the house of cards that we've built up over decades and decades. And getting back to your actual question about central bank digital currencies, this is like the final arrow in their quiver, where not only won't we have paper money, which is at least private and discreet, everything is going to go through your computer. Everything is going to be monitored. They'll be in a position to credit and debit your account especially whether or not you're a good little lamb. The Canadian truckers last year had a taste of this, where the government basically reached into their bank accounts because it didn't like what they were doing. So if the public sheepishly accepts central bank digital currencies, we'll all be relegated. We'll be one step further towards being serfs, which we're on the way to doing right now. I know that doesn't resonate with a lot of people when I say that.
What would be, yeah.
Well, because we have a high standard of living still. I mean, we drive luxury cars, we live in big houses, we fly in jet planes. How are we anything like serfs? But it's the standard of living is gradually going down. Your personal freedoms are going down. And I guess the average person doesn't really care about it much because a quarter of the population is on Zoloft or Ritalin or Prozac. And anyway, I'm a
Xanax.
I'm a great pessimist as far as the way things are going.
Yeah, okay, no, I hear what you're saying, and when I speak to people about the dangers of the central bank digital currency, things I hear back are, well, we're already, using debit and credit cards. They already know everything we're doing. So how would this change anything? Or I'll hear, but I don't have anything to hide, so I don't care, if they're watching my every step. I mean, what do you say to these folks? Any thoughts here?
Well, I'd say that they really ought to reform their entire method of thinking. Look, the things that made Western civilization what it is, far better and far different from any other civilization in world history, privacy is one of them. And it doesn't matter if you don't think you have nothing to hide. You have a right to hide whatever you do. And this is being washed away because you're told you have nothing to worry about. But this is just one of the pillars of civilization that are being washed away right from under us. And since money is the lifeblood of any civilization, it represents the fruit of your past work, which is congealed in your savings, and everything that you want to buy and sell and provide for others, it's all done through currencies. And when these people that run these central banks have control, total control of the currencies, which will be the case when these CBDCs go into effect, you don't own your life anymore. Of course, most people already don't because they're wage slaves. They're deeply in debt. They already have to. Most people already have to do and say and think exactly what they're told, because otherwise they won't be able to pay their mortgage. They won't be able to pay their credit card debt. They won't be able to pay their student loan debt. So it's already pretty much game over for the personal freedoms that we grew up learning to love and cherish.
What do you think is the end game of the central banks with the digital currency of the governments? Is it, they'll say, well, it's, to stop illicit activity, the black market, tax evasion. We're going to be, saving so much money. This is great for the nation. Or is there more to it?
Well, first of all, this is a philosophical question. It's a question of what's right and what's wrong. And I would point out, is there anything wrong with tax evasion? It's your money that the government is stealing from you under a legal cover. You might recall that it was less than 100 years ago that the income tax didn't exist almost anywhere in the world. In fact, it was 100 years ago that all the governments of the world basically survived on import duties and excise taxes. Since then, we've had many, many taxes, most invasive of which is the income tax, but there'll be wealth taxes and all the rest of it. So this is a moral principle we're dealing with. It's not a question of how can we best fund the government. The question is not how to best fund the government. The question is how to defund the government. So in principle, I've got no problem with tax evasion at all. And there were some other things that you mentioned, but there's a whole panoply of things that we can talk about that make me gloomy. And of course,
Yes,
earlier you
I'm
asked,
smiling because I'm sure a lot of folks at home are saying, "You tell them, Doug."
well, they won't. They won't.
Okay, let me ask you this
Nobody's going to
question
do
then.
anything about it because, as I pointed out before, everybody is so trapped by having to pay their mortgages, can't afford to lose their jobs, et cetera, that they'll basically do what they were told. Like during the recent COVID hysteria, uh, you know, doctors and nurses basically just rolled over like sheep and cows because they're all employees these days. And if you don't do what your employer tells you, you get fired, maybe you lose your license. So of course they just zip the lip and have this disaster imposed on us. It's nothing but a bad annual flu that was made into a political mechanism to further control. Look, a lot of people in the world are interested in money. Everybody's interested in money. Everybody wants more money to get the things you want. But there are a lot of people that are really interested in power. They're interested in controlling other people. In fact, I'll go so far as to say you got two kinds of people in the world. You got people that are interested in controlling the physical universe, creating things, making things, controlling things. And then you got people that are interested in controlling other people. And those are the kind of people that go into government in its various aspects. And they're dangerous, criminally oriented people. That's how I define a criminal, somebody that imposes himself on somebody else's life and property. Anyway, I think I've gone off on another tangent again. I'm sorry, Daniela. We could talk about specific things that I expect to happen.
I love when you go on tangents. I love when you go on tangents, and then because then it just creates other questions for me. Because now I'm thinking, but I know there are certain politicians in history that you've admired, but I feel like that's a completely different conversation.
It's a very short list, I assure you.
It's a short list, but I know they exist. Sticking to central bank digital currencies a second. If we are well on the way, which country, do you have a feeling as to who would be the first? We know China was testing it, but do you have a feeling of who would be the first and successful at doing so?
Probably a country that is used to doing what they're told. Sweden. At this point, everybody buys and sells using their iPhones, so it's a short step from there to using something that clears through your bank, your private, your commercial bank, to clearing through the central bank. That's an easy step. There are some countries that'll roll over. Some countries are resisting it, like surprisingly Nigeria, a country of 200 million people, very poor, backward, but everybody's got a cell phone, so the government thought it would be natural to put their worthless inflated currency, make it easy for people to use their cell phone as opposed to carrying around wads of worthless paper. The Nigerians overwhelmingly revolted against it. So it's unpredictable how the market's going to react to this. They'll probably offer everybody a free $100 digital to groove them into it and show them that it's a nice thing and we're on your side.
Do you think, so Doug, you don't think it's important for the U.S. to be the first? Do you think this is part of their agenda? Would they want to be the first?
Look, the U.S. government thinks it controls the world. And one of the major means by which it does that is the fact that the whole world accepts U.S. dollars. In fact, the major export of the U.S. for decades has not been Boeings or wheat or things of that nature. It's been dollars. We ship dollars to the Japanese and the Germans for cars and computers and the Colombians for cocaine. They ship us those things and we ship them dollars. And those dollars are literally printed up out of nothing by the Federal Reserve. So the U.S. government doesn't want to lose its international monetary franchise, but it is going to lose it. Look, the most recent stupid thing they did was confiscate the overseas assets of Russians. So now everybody's thinking around the world, you know what? If I use dollars or if I have assets in the US, this government in Washington is so out of control that they can unilaterally lock down or confiscate what I have, just as they did to the Russians.
Yep.
This is why you're hearing talk about the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, the Iranians, a lot of countries, the Indonesians, they're all talking about coming up
Yep.
with a replacement for the dollar. And they will. The dollar has no backing except the good faith of the US government. And nobody has any reason to trust the US government at all at this point.
To that point, Doug, one of the key takeaways from the wrapped World Economic Forum was when Saudi Finance Minister Mohammed al-Jadaan, on a panel on Saudi Arabia's transformation, made it clear that they would consider trading in currencies other than the US dollar. Now, of course, they hedged, saying, quote, "We enjoy a very strategic relationship with China, and we enjoy that same strategic relationship with other nations, including the US, and we want to develop that with Europe and other countries." So not completely excluding the US yet, but we know what they're alluding to. And to your point, countries looking for solutions outside the US dollar. What is the US doing about this, do you think? Like you said, they put
Daniela,
themselves in this position with the sanctions
they can do
imposed on
about
Russia.
it at this point.
But yeah.
Because look, the U.S. government's debt is $31 trillion and growing by someplace on the order of $1 to $2 trillion per year. So there's really nothing they can do about it at this point. Most government spending doesn't come from taxes from individuals and corporations. It comes from selling debt to the Federal Reserve, which then the U.S. government goes out and spends. I'll tell you what's going to happen is that since the US dollar is a floating abstraction, and all of these governments realize that it's losing value by 5 or 10% or something on that order per year, so they don't like the idea that they have to settle their debts through New York. I mean, you think the Chinese like to pay for things with US dollars? It's using their adversary's currency. What they're going to do is go back to gold. People say, well, maybe we'll use the Chinese yuan. No, nobody trusts the Chinese and their yuan either. So, and look, the Russians and the Chinese, when they trade with each other, until recently, had to use dollars. But they don't want to use dollars. But they don't trust each other's currencies either. And why should they? They're just paper figments of their central bank's imagination. The whole world is going to go back to gold, Daniela. That's what's going to happen. People are going to trade with gold. Again, it's going to happen.
I'm happy you're bringing that up. I actually did a whole in-depth conversation with Frank Giustra, who you know well, back in October about this. And in one of his recent articles, we talking about the record buying we saw from central banks in 2022. He says the likely buyers are the usual suspects. We know China, Russia, India, and Saudi Arabia. But he says, why would they be doing this without some future purpose? A likely reason is that a gold backing would give any new trading currency the credibility it would need to compete with the reigning US dollar. So do you agree? I'm assuming you're agreeing with this thesis, but why are, if China is stockpiling gold, not telling anyone about it, we don't know the real numbers, what are they planning to do with it? Is it some sort of new gold-backed currency? I'm assuming you think yes. Am I wrong?
Well, ideally, there shouldn't be a gold-backed currency. Gold is money, and it should be used as money. And I know this is going to sound outrageous to everybody listening, but the government shouldn't be in the money business, okay? That's not what the government should be doing. I mean, the purpose of the government, which is actually just an instrument of force, is to protect you from force. An army, a police force, and a court system to adjudicate disputes without resorting to force. So they shouldn't be in the money business. they're not trustworthy. The type of people that go to work for the government are innately untrustworthy. So we should just be using gold. But the answer to the question is yes. I suspect that the first step on this road is going to be that the Chinese and even the Russians are going to start out with a gold-backed ruble and a gold-backed yuan. It's going to happen. And at that point, if they show themselves to be somewhat trustworthy, people are going to gravitate away from the dollar because the US government is a bankrupt entity at this point. Why should you trust their currency? I mean, it's ridiculous. And we'll go back to gold. There's really nothing else you can use.
And there's nothing
for
the
money.
US can do to stop it.
No, there's nothing they can do to stop it. People say, well, maybe the world will go to Bitcoin. Well, maybe it will. I mean, there are certain advantages to Bitcoin as money, but I'm putting my money on gold, although I own some Bitcoin.
And that's what brings me to your other key forecast for this year. Is you say clearly it's going to be the year of gold. And anyone I know that's been following our work will say, but you know, you've liked gold for so long. But would you not agree, Doug, that it just feels different this time around?
It does. We're heading into a major crisis. Look, for years I've said that we're entering upon a phenomenon that I call the Greater Depression, because it's going to be much worse, much longer lasting, and much different than the unpleasantness of 1929 to 1946. And how do I feel about gold? Look, I've been saying for the last several years, it's going up, but it's money, okay? So you ought to treat it as a savings vehicle, not as a speculative vehicle. And I've consistently bought gold for many, many years, and I've never sold a single ounce. So I've been buying it since about $40, and now it's about, $1,900. So I feel better having saved in gold than in dollars, but sometimes it's a good speculation. But right now, it's kind of reasonably priced relative to everything else in the world, relative to a suit of clothes, relative to a meal. You go back historically, gold's kind of reasonably priced. But I still think it's going to go up because I think that we're on the edge of a panic. And when a real panic hits, people like to hold money that is tangible in their own hand, not the promise of some bankrupt government or bankrupt central bank. So that's why I think gold's going higher. Reasonably priced at this point, but it's going higher.
Well, especially if the central banks want to hoard it, they want it. If everyone is going to want gold, and as we know, not as much exploration is taking place. We're not finding these gold deposits. So yeah, to your point, what will it do to the price?
There's all kinds of things going on that most people haven't even heard about. For instance, when I was in Zimbabwe the last time, it was about, how long ago now? 6 years. I spent a lot of time. I've been to Zimbabwe and most African countries a lot over the years, but here's an anecdote that you haven't heard anywhere else. I became very friendly with Gideon Gono. Gideon Gono was the head of the Central Bank of Zimbabwe. And oddly enough, Gideon Gono's signature is on the Zimbabwe $100 trillion note. But he's actually a well-educated, intelligent guy. You think he'd be a blithering idiot having printed up $100 trillion notes. Well, he had to do it to pay the army. But here's the thing that's interesting. Gideon gave me a paper that he wrote promoting that he was trying to sell to Comrade Mugabe, who's dead now, that they ought to have a Zimbabwe gold dollar. Now, that's a shocker. Most people don't know that. So there are things going on behind the scenes that we don't hear about on CNN or MSNBC or Fox.
No, and thank you for sharing that with us. I also curious to get your thoughts on inflation. I know how you feel about CPI. You don't buy the numbers. Whatever figures or metrics they're using are cherry-picked. What's the real deal? What's your take on inflation, Doug?
It's going higher. And the main reason, there are other reasons, but the main reason it's going higher is because the main way that governments all over the world can finance themselves is not by taxes, it's by printing money. So when they print money, that is the cause of inflation. It's not the butcher or the baker or the gasoline maker that causes inflation. They're just reacting to it, the excess of money printed by these central banks. So, inflation is going higher. It's going a lot higher. And the only reason it won't go higher is that maybe we'll have a catastrophic deflation where there's so much debt in the world as a consequence of inflation. A lot of these companies and a lot of individuals are greatly over indebted. The economy slows down. They can't pay the debt. They default on their bonds. And what happens to that $1 billion in bonds that a company might have issued? Well, it just dies and goes to money heaven, and the $1 billion it represents disappears. Same thing when an individual goes bankrupt. We're going to see a lot of that this year and the next. So that could get out of control. You could have a catastrophic deflation, even while the government is still printing up money, trying to maintain the current structure. But I've got to tell you, I really couldn't be more bearish for all kinds of long-term reasons. I mean, the culture itself, the civilization itself, is in the process of slow motion collapse, and the financial markets are all overpriced. I mean, bonds had negative yields. Like I said, I thought that was metaphysically impossible, but I was wrong. But people forget that it was only in the early 80s that the US government was paying up to 18% to borrow money. That's going to happen again. I'm not saying this year, but it's going to happen.
You make the argument. Would you say it's the most challenging time since World War II?
Yeah, I'd say that it is, because it's no longer a unipolar world with the U.S. in charge, or a bipolar world where it was the U.S. and the Soviet Union. There's a bunch of countries out there that are feeling their oats and are acting very independent, so that we could be looking at more dust-ups, such as the one going on now between Russia and the Ukraine.
Thank you for mentioning that. I selfishly wanted to have you on to talk about this. We're on day, 334 of the war, but I was having some very good conversations in the Cambone household over the holidays, and my brother, who watches all the shows, was bringing up that, yes, I have a lot of experts coming on saying that that the U.S. should not be funding. We have 32 trillion of debt, and yet we're funding this war. We should not be involved. But there's never, or I haven't seen a convincing counter argument as to, what would it be, or what would it look like if the U.S. didn't get involved?
Well,
do they have a choice?
Yeah, well, they definitely have a choice. To start with, what business does the U.S. government have getting involved in a border war between two shithole dictatorships on the other side of the world? That's actually insane. But of course, especially since World War II, the end of World War II, the U.S. government has tried to act like the world's policeman, and every time it goes anywhere, it creates a disaster. So that's from a practical point of view. But let's look at it from another point of view, and that is that this all started with the so-called Maidan Revolution, where the U.S. was instrumental in replacing a Russian puppet running the Ukraine with essentially a U.S. puppet. Okay? But that wasn't the agreement with the Russians. I mean, it's very much as if the Russians, or the Chinese, decided they were going to make the Canadian and Mexican governments puppets of theirs. The U.S. wouldn't like it. Well, the Russians don't like it when the U.S. is doing the same thing. And most people are completely unaware of the fact that starting in 2014, the Ukrainians, those two provinces called the Donetsk region, broke off. And there's been a war going on, the Ukrainians against the Lugansk and Donetsk governments has been going on since 2014. So what was on Putin's mind? Does he want to conquer Europe? First of all, it's impossible for all kinds of reasons. But he was trying to solve a border war that the Ukrainians were, because these two provinces wanted to break off from the Ukraine. They're mostly Russians. And the Ukraine is an artificial country to start with. It didn't even exist before Lenin created it in 1922. This is a whole other thing. But now, he thought that he was just going to punish Kiev and, get those two provinces independent. And it's gotten out of control at this point. And now with the Americans and the Germans and the British and the French talking about sending tanks there, which the Ukrainians are incapable of using, that means troops, this might wind up in a nuclear exchange. It's completely insane, completely unnecessary. Putin or Russia should take over those two provinces full of Russians who voted, incidentally, to leave the Ukraine. But, the U.S. stuck its nose into it, and we might be looking at World War III. That's probably more than you wanted to hear. But
okay, so interesting. So if no, it's not. I have more questions because, okay, let's say the theory is accurate, and the U.S. just was hands off, and Russia invaded, took over Ukraine. We let an autocratic nation take over not a very good democratic nation, but still a democratic nation.
I mean, but Zelensky's a clown who's turned the Ukraine into a police state, a dictatorship. You don't hear about this in the Western press.
But when you say it would be impossible for Putin to take over the rest of Europe, why? Because how do we know that he wouldn't go for Poland or Finland? I mean, what message would that send to them?
Well, essentially, Russia is just a gas station with an attached gun store in the middle of a wheat field. That's really all there is to it. That's all they can produce. In fact, let me go further. Over the next generation, you're going to find Russia itself, regardless of what happens with the current thing in the Ukraine, you're going to find Russia itself breaking up into many different countries, the way Yugoslavia did, actually. It's quite analogous. I mean, Russia is a multicultural domestic empire that's run out of Moscow, and lots of different nationalities and ethnicities and so forth in Siberia and the Caucasus, these areas. They're going to separate from, Russia is only 50% ethnic Russians, so that'll remain Russia, but most of what's currently Russia, the land area, is going to break up into different countries, and that's going to be more problems, more trouble. I hope the U.S. doesn't get involved in that too, because the U.S. is bankrupt at this point.
You're placing
and the only
a lot
part
of
the U.S. government
faith
that still works is the military. It's like a golden hammer. We got a hammer, we got to use it. It's crazy.
So you're basically saying if we just let Putin be, but now we've kind of awoken the dragon.
Well, the dragon's not going anywhere because, like I said, Moscow isn't even going to be able to keep Russia together in one country. Russia's going to break up into, who knows, a half a dozen or a dozen different countries over the next generation. I know that's a shocking thing to say, but believe it or not, I gave a speech in New Orleans back in the mid-'80s saying that the Soviet Union was going to break up too. In fact, let me go further. Many of the countries in the world today are going to break up into smaller countries. Brazil is probably going to break up eventually into two countries, North and South at least. Bolivia is going to break up into two or three. All the countries in Africa are going to fall apart and reestablish themselves along tribal lines. It's happening in France and Spain and even in England, or I should say Great Britain. So the colors of the map on the wall are going to be running in the years to come. This dust up in the Ukraine and Russia, it's just an overture.
I want to talk about what Doug Casey's up to these days as we wrap here. I know you're working on a few new books. And in my research, Doug, I actually stumbled upon your Donahue interview from the 80s. I knew about it, but I actually sat down the other night and watched it.
Oh.
First of all, and that was when you came out with Crisis Investing, the #1 book at the time in America.
It was the day, and I had that interview with Donahue the day before the national elections. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry.
That's right. But what struck me most, and by the way, you haven't changed, and your thoughts, what you were saying back then, are still true today. So it's still so relevant today. But what struck me the most was daytime television actually had intelligent conversations back once upon a time. Here's an incredible interview where people are actually discussing, financial issues. Donahue with some very good questions that you wouldn't see on daytime TV today when you come out with your next best-selling book. True or false, Doug? Do you not agree with that?
Absolutely true. One of the things I liked about Donahue was that he asked intelligent questions and gave you time to answer the questions in detail. So it was an hour conversation, not just, sound bites that could, people's attention span has dropped because everything is on, these electronic devices which cut off people's attention span. I don't think they even read books anymore.
It's a great interview.
Oh, thank you.
I just kept thinking, if Crisis Investing came out today, if Crisis Investing came out today, I was like, I don't know which daytime show would book a Doug Casey. I really don't.
It's too politically incorrect.
Because they don't want to have these in-depth discussions.
Yeah, no.
But you could have in the 80s. So there was definitely better television, but...
No question about it, Daniela. No question about it. If you're politically incorrect, you can't get on mainstream media today. It just really can't be done, number one. And if you do get on, it's not going to be for an hour-long conversation. So where you are right now is where the action is.
So to that point, you're writing new books. One is a guidebook for the young, right?
Yep.
Which talks about college, and I know you think most people should probably not be in college. But let me ask you this.
Definitely not.
Do you feel they should not be in college because in the US you're just so much in debt when you're out of college? What happens if you're in a country like Canada where it's cheap to go to school? Should you go?
No, I don't think so. Because those 4 years from roughly 18 to 22 are among the best and most important in your life. And you shouldn't misallocate them sitting in a desk, listening to some teacher yap at you, picking up mainly useless information. So what this book is about is what should you do with the time and the money that you would spend going to college? Where should you go? What should you learn? What should you read? It's kind of a guidebook to becoming a Renaissance man, or at least not becoming an idiot, which is what happens to most kids when they suffer 4 years of indoctrination in college.
Whoa.
So no, I advise against college. I advise taking education into your own hands, unless you need to learn the skills you would for becoming a doctor or a lawyer or an engineer or something like that.
I always say 18 to 21 were definitely the best years of my life. So Doug, just I know we talked about various topics here. We probably needed 2 more hours. But just, wrapping it all up here for the folks at home, we talked your forecast for 2023, just some guidance. What should we be doing?
Well, if you want to talk about money, which is one of the beats that I walk, buy gold stocks because they're very cheap relative to the price of gold. Many have good dividend yields, and they're selling at historically low price earnings ratios. So I like gold stocks, I like uranium stocks, and I like oil stocks. There are a lot of good oil stocks out there that are very depressed because of the ESG DIE nonsense, where everybody thinks, no oil. In fact, countries like Colombia are saying you can't even explore for oil anymore. That's how ESG DIE influence that they are. So I'd buy oil stocks. You can get great oil companies that are yielding 7-8% and more in dividends, selling at 4 and 5 times earnings. So it doesn't matter how bad, well, it does matter, but no matter how bad the world at large gets, if you can improve your personal financial situation, you and your family and your friends will do better, even if the rest of the world is having a very hard time, which they will, incidentally. From now and for the rest of this decade, it's not just 2023 that's going to be rough and tumble.
Doug, on that note, I want to thank you for your time. Thank you for joining me today, and thank you for enlightening us with your insights. It's always a pleasure speaking with you.
Well, next time I'm on, you can call me up on what I'm wrong on, and I'll eat my words with a fork and spoon.
There you go. I'll take you to see Hamilton. But I hope I see you before then. And once again, thank you for joining us, Doug.
Real pleasure, Daniela. Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll have much more coming your way. So be sure to stay tuned to the Daniela Cambone Show here on Stansberry Research. And you can sign up at danielacambone.com to stay on top of all these incredible interviews. That's it for me. Thanks for watching.
Opinions expressed on this program are solely those of the contributor and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Stansberry Research, its parent company, or affiliates.